The rise of the peasant emperor. On a crisp December morning in 1034, the marble floors of Constantinople's Hagia Sophia echoed with hushed whispers as a most unusual emperor strode toward his coronation. Michael IV, barefoot, calloused, and bearing the rough hands of a man who had counted coins for a living, moved with the deliberate grace of someone who knew exactly how improbable his presence was. The aristocrats lining the cathedral's gilded walls could barely contain their disdain. Here was a peasant, a common money changer, about to don the purple robes of the most sophisticated empire in Christendom. Yet in this moment of supreme triumph, none could have guessed that this peasant emperor would transform from an object of ridicule into one of Byzantium's most capable rulers. This is the story of a man who parlayed a forbidden romance with an empress into an 11-year reign that would save an empire. A tale of ambition, cunning, and raw talent that would make Machiavelli blush. Here was a ruler who proved that true power lies not in the circumstances of one's birth, but in the capacity to seize destiny with both hands, even if those hands were calloused from counting copper coins. Ambition and intrigue in Byzantine markets. The markets of Paphlagonia stank of fish and ambition. Among the hawkers and hagglers of this backwater Byzantine province, a teenage Michael hunched over his wooden money-changing table, fingers dancing across coins with uncanny precision. Each copper piece that passed through his hands was a tiny ambassador from some distant realm. Abbasid dinars, Bulgarian byzants, Armenian drums, and in their worn surfaces he read stories of power that reached far beyond his dusty corner of the empire. His brother John, a eunuch with a shark's smile and a spider's talent for weaving webs of influence, had already begun his meteoric rise through Constantinople's ecclesiastical bureaucracy. While John whispered in the ears of bishops and generals, Michael mastered the arcane mathematics of exchange rates and interest calculations. The local merchants learned quickly, cross this illiterate peasant at your peril. He could spot a clipped coin at 20 paces and calculate compound interest faster than a scholar could recite his prayers. In the summer of 1021, as drought withered the crops and tension with Georgia threatened war, John orchestrated his masterstroke. Constantinople's treasury needed keen minds, he argued to his growing network of patronage. Who better to audit the empire's accounts than his shrewd young brother? The aristocrats laughed until Michael spotted 3 separate embezzlement schemes in his first week. By month's end, he had saved the treasury more gold than most nobles saw in a lifetime. But it was in the shadows of the Bucolian palace that fate dealt its strangest hand. Empress Zoe, 48 years old, brilliant, dangerous, and trapped in a loveless marriage to the pompous Romanos III, had taken to watching the handsome young money changer at work. Michael felt her gaze like sunshine on the back of his neck. Their eyes met across the treasury hall, and history held its breath. What happened next would shake the empire to its foundations. But on that sweltering afternoon, as Michael's rough fingers sorted through the day's receipts, even the palace gossips couldn't have imagined that this barefoot peasant was about to launch the most audacious gambit in Byzantine history. The coins passed through his hands, copper, silver, gold, each one a step on the ladder he was about to climb. And at the top, the imperial throne itself, though its current occupant didn't yet know he was living on borrowed time. The stage was set. The players had taken their positions. And in the great game of power that was 11th century Byzantium, the low-born money changer was about to teach the empire's blue bloods a lesson they would never forget. Sometimes the deadliest player is the one they never saw coming. The Serpent's Game, Love and Power in Constantinople. Love in Constantinople was a serpent's game, played in whispers and sidelong glances. While Emperor Romanos III busied himself with grandiose building projects and failed military campaigns, his wife Zoe prowled the palace corridors like a caged lioness. She found in Michael what her historian uncle might have called a perfect storm of desirability, youth, vigor, and that most intoxicating quality of all, raw, unbridled ambition. Their first clandestine meeting in the palace gardens set the pattern. Michael arrived to discuss treasury matters, his ledgers clutched to his chest like a shield. He left 4 hours later with the Empress's confidence and a dangerous gleam in his eye. The palace chamberlains, those professional keepers of secrets, began to notice things. Perfumed notes passed in darkened corridors, meaningful glances across crowded throne rooms, the Empress's increasingly frequent needs to review the accounts. In the spring of 1034, Emperor Romanos developed a curious new habit of taking long, solitary baths. On April 11th, as dawn broke over the Bosphorus, servants found him face down in the imperial bathing chamber. The official story claimed a fainting spell, though nobody could explain the bruises on his neck. By sunset, Michael and Zoe were married. By midnight, a former peasant wore the imperial crown. But Michael had miscalculated. The people of Constantinople, who had tolerated many scandals from their rulers, found this particular romance a step too far. Riots erupted in the streets. "Peasant usurper!" they screamed. "Monster!" The aristocrats, those ancient families who claimed descent from Roman senators, closed ranks against him. They whispered of poison and treachery, of an empress bewitched by a common money changer's charms. Here was Michael's first true test as emperor. The traditional response would have been a purge, to paint the streets red with noble blood. Instead, he did something that left the empire speechless. He walked barefoot through the riot-torn streets, alone and unguarded, directly into the angry mob. "Judge me not by my birth," he declared, his voice carrying across the forum, "but by what I will build for you." The crowd fell silent. Here was either a madman or a genius, and Byzantium had always had a soft spot for both. In the imperial bedchamber that night, as Zoe slept the sleep of the triumphant, Michael sat awake, his calloused feet dangling over the edge of the most powerful throne in Christendom. The easy part, the seduction, the coup, the crown, was over. Now came the real challenge, proving that a peasant could outthink, outmaneuver, and outgovern the blue-blooded sons of empire who yearned to see him fall. Dawn was breaking over Constantinople, and with it, the true test of the barefoot emperor was about to begin. Michael IV, mastering the Byzantine chessboard. The imperial palace was a labyrinth of deadly protocols, where a misplaced word could spark a rebellion and a botched ceremony could topple a dynasty. Michael IV attacked this challenge like a master chess player, moving his pieces with deliberate precision while his opponents still thought they were playing checkers. His first move: converting the palace's vast network of eunuch spies from enemies into allies by offering them something no previous emperor had: respect. His brother John, now promoted to chief minister, proved invaluable in navigating the Byzantine maze of court politics. While aristocrats sneered at Michael's common accent and unpolished manners, John was building a shadow government of talented commoners, merchants, scholars, and administrators who owed their loyalty not to ancient bloodlines, but to merit and ambition. The old guard watched in horror as their monopoly on power began to crack. The first crisis came in autumn, when grain shipments from Egypt failed to arrive. The noble families, sensing weakness, hoarded their supplies and waited for hunger to spark unrest. But Michael had learned something in his days as a money changer that no amount of noble education could teach. The real economy ran on trust, not gold. He summoned the empire's Jewish and Arab merchants, groups traditionally kept at arm's length, and struck a bold deal. Within weeks, grain flooded into Constantinople from Syria and Palestine. The price of bread actually fell, and with it, the aristocrats' hopes of an easy victory. But Michael's most cunning innovation came in the reorganization of the imperial mint. Drawing on his expertise in currency exchange, he implemented a revolutionary system of standardized weights and measures. Counterfeiters who had grown fat on aristocratic protection suddenly found their schemes unraveled. The empire's gold coins, for the first time in generations, carried their full weight in metal. The treasury swelled, and with it, Michael's popularity among merchants and commoners alike. Yet even as he consolidated power, the emperor's body betrayed him. The epileptic seizures that had plagued him since youth grew worse under the strain of rule. During one crucial Senate meeting, as he argued for military reforms, his words suddenly slurred and his body convulsed. The assembled nobles waited for weakness, but Michael transformed his affliction into strength. Rising shakily to his feet, he declared his seizures divine visits, signs of God's direct communication. In a deeply religious empire, who dared argue with divine favor? Behind closed doors, Michael knew time was his enemy. Each seizure left him weaker. Each year on the throne borrowed against an increasingly uncertain future. But as spring bloomed across Constantinople in 1035, the barefoot emperor had achieved something his critics had thought impossible. He had learned not just to wear the purple, but to wield it. The real question now was not whether a peasant could rule Byzantium, but whether his body would allow him to complete the transformation he had begun. The revolutionary reign of Michael IV. Bulgaria erupted like a powder keg in the summer of 1035. Peter Delian, claiming to be the grandson of Tsar Samuel, raised the banner of rebellion against Byzantine rule. The aristocrats smirked. Surely now the peasant emperor would show his true colors. War was a nobleman's game after all. Yet Michael IV was about to demonstrate that a lifetime of calculating odds had taught him more about strategy than any amount of noble warfare training. Rather than lead from the rear, as tradition dictated, Michael joined his troops on the march north. His epilepsy be damned. He slept in tents, ate army rations, and walked among his soldiers. The sight of their emperor, still barefoot, even in camp, sent morale soaring. When veterans spoke of these campaigns years later, they would remember how he knew common soldiers by name, how he could recall their villages, their families, their stories. An army that marched for pay now fought for loyalty. His military innovations shocked the empire's old guard. Drawing on his experience managing complex financial networks, Michael revolutionized the army's supply chain. Rather than rely on slow-moving baggage trains, he established a series of forward supply depots, each integrated with local markets. His armies moved with unprecedented speed, appearing where the Bulgarians least expected them. By winter, Delian's rebellion was crumbling. But Michael's greatest victory came not on the battlefield, but in the marketplace. Instead of punishing captured Bulgarian cities with the traditional looting and pillage, he offered them something revolutionary: economic integration. Local Bulgarian merchants found themselves with direct access to Constantinople's markets. Rebel strongholds transformed into trading hubs practically overnight. When Michael's armies approached, city gates increasingly opened without a fight. The drought of 1037 tested his administration like nothing before. While other emperors might have resorted to prayer and processions, Michael attacked the crisis with a money changer's precision. He established a network of municipal granaries, each operating on a sophisticated credit system that he designed himself. Cities could borrow against future harvests, spreading the risk of crop failure across the entire empire. When rain finally returned in 1038, Byzantium emerged stronger rather than weaker from the crisis. His building projects reflected the same practical brilliance. Instead of erecting the usual churches and palaces, Michael focused on aqueducts, roads, and harbors. He expanded Constantinople's hospitals, staffing them with Jewish and Arab physicians who brought medical knowledge from Baghdad and Cairo. The aristocrats called it scandalous, until these same hospitals saved thousands during a summer fever outbreak. But perhaps his most radical act was the creation of what he called the People's Senate, an advisory council that included merchants, craftsmen, and even farmers alongside the traditional nobles. When critics protested that common men couldn't understand statecraft, Michael reportedly replied, "I was a common man yesterday, and yet today I outthink you all." The nobility's monopoly on power was crumbling, brick by brick, replaced by something new, a meritocracy of talent rather than birth. As 1038 drew to a close, even Michael's harshest critics couldn't deny his achievements. The treasury was full, the borders were secure, and the empire hummed with newfound efficiency. The barefoot emperor had not just survived, he had revolutionized Byzantium itself. Yet in quiet moments when the pain of his worsening seizures left him gasping, Michael knew his greatest challenges still lay ahead. Time was running out, and there was still so much left to build. The emperor's struggle and legacy. The emperor's apartments in 1038 became a theater of hidden suffering. By night, Michael writhed on cold marble floors as seizures racked his body, attended only by his most trusted servants. By day, he governed with the intensity of a man who could feel time slipping through his fingers. The courtiers whispered that his bare feet now shuffled rather than strode, that his once sharp eyes had taken on the haunted look of a man who had glimpsed his own mortality. Yet even as his body failed him, Michael's mind burned brighter than ever. He transformed his sleepless nights into a revolution in governance. Between seizures, he dictated a series of reforms that would outlive him by centuries. New laws protecting peasant landholdings, regulations standardizing weights and measures across the empire, and a revolutionary system for training civil servants based on merit rather than birth. When his hands shook too badly to sign documents, he had his seal redesigned so it could be pressed instead of requiring his signature. His relationship with Empress Zoe had cooled to glacial temperatures. She had given him the throne, but not an heir, and now spent her days in the palace laboratories concocting perfumes and plotting with would-be usurpers. Michael responded by throwing himself into an obsessive building campaign of monasteries and churches. If his legacy couldn't be secured through bloodline, he would carve it in stone. The Neomoni Monastery on Chios became his masterpiece, a stunning complex that merged classical Byzantine architecture with innovations drawn from Arab and Armenian designs. The selection of his successor became Michael's final chess game. His nephew, Michael Caliphates, showed promise, quick-minded and ambitious, much like his uncle had been. But there was something in the young man's eyes that troubled the emperor, a hunger that went beyond ambition into something darker. Still, with time running out and options limited, Michael IV began carefully positioning his nephew for power, all while setting up a complex system of checks and balances to constrain him. In 1040, when news arrived of a massive Bulgarian army massing in the north, Michael made a decision that stunned the empire. Despite barely being able to mount a horse, he would lead the campaign personally. His physicians protested. His brother John begged him to reconsider. But Michael understood something they didn't. A strong succession required one final show of force. "Let them see," he told his trembling servants as they helped him don his armor, "that even a dying emperor can still make the earth shake." The campaign that followed became instant legend. Unable to ride for long periods, Michael was carried between battles in a litter. Yet the sight of their emperor, gaunt, determined, and still barefoot even in war, inspired the troops to impossible victories. The Bulgarians, expecting to face a weakened empire, found instead an army driven by desperate loyalty to their dying leader. By spring 1041, the northern frontier was secure for a generation. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Each seizure now left Michael bedridden for days. His mind remained sharp, but his body was failing rapidly. In his final months, he threw himself into one last project, a detailed set of instructions for his successor, a blueprint for ruling an empire that the peasant emperor had reimagined from the ground up. As he dictated these final thoughts, his voice growing weaker by the day, even his most hardened servants wept at the sight of so much wisdom flowing from a man who had once been dismissed as a common money changer. The irony was not lost on Michael that his greatest success, transforming Byzantium into a place where a peasant could rise to become emperor, might also prove his undoing. He had created a world of possibilities, but those same possibilities made the succession dangerously uncertain. As autumn approached in 1041, the barefoot emperor prepared for his final battle, not against Bulgarians or aristocrats, but against the legacy of his own revolutionary reign. The last acts of Emperor Michael IV, a legacy of meritocracy. The autumn of 1041 painted Constantinople in colors of fire, but Emperor Michael IV barely noticed from his sickbed in the monastery of the Holy Anagi Roy. His last great act of theatre was about to begin, a death worthy of the empire he had transformed. The man who had orchestrated 1,000 subtle schemes would now direct his own finale, turning even his death into a weapon for the empire's good. He chose to die as he had ruled, not in the imperial palace surrounded by luxury, but in a monk's cell, attended by the same common people he had elevated to power. The symbolism was lost on no one. Aristocrats who sought last-minute audiences found themselves sharing benches with bakers, merchants, and soldiers, all equal in the anteroom of death. Through his actions, Michael was delivering one final lesson about merit over birth. In moments of lucidity between seizures, he summoned officials one by one, spinning a web of posthumous alliances and safeguards. To each, he assigned a specific role in protecting his reforms, binding them with oaths so solemn that breaking them would damn their souls. But in private moments, watching his nephew, Michael Caliphates, pace the monastery corridors like a caged beast, the dying emperor's eyes reflected doubt. Had he created a system strong enough to survive its creator's passing? On December 10th, as a bitter wind howled off the Bosphorus, Michael made his last public appearance. Unable to walk, he ordered himself carried to the monastery's balcony. The crowd that had gathered below fell silent at the sight of their once vigorous emperor, now a shadow held upright only by will. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried the same command that had once cowed Senate chambers. Remember not the emperor, but what the empire can become when every person, high or low, is given room to rise. Hours later, in his cell, Michael performed one final act of calculated brilliance. He renounced the throne while still living, taking monastic vows in a ceremony witnessed by both church and state officials. This seemingly humble act was, in fact, a masterstroke, legally strengthening his chosen succession plan while simultaneously ensuring himself a saint's burial. Even in death, the money changer's son was still counting odds and calculating advantages. Near midnight, as priests chanted prayers and palace officials waited nervously in the corridors, Michael summoned his nephew one last time. What passed between them remains one of history's great mysteries. The only witness, a young monk assigned to tend the dying emperor's lamp, reported that Michael spoke for nearly an hour, his voice too low to hear. When Caliphates emerged, his face was ashen. Michael IV, the barefoot emperor who had revolutionized an empire, died before dawn on December 11th, 1041. They found him facing east, his rough peasant's feet exposed one final time, a slight smile playing on his lips. He had orchestrated everything, the succession, the safeguards, the symbols. Yet even he, master strategist that he was, could not have predicted how spectacularly his nephew would betray every principle he had died protecting. Within months, Michael Fifi Caliphates would exile Empress Zoe, attempt to dismantle the meritocracy his uncle had built, and spark a popular revolution that would see him dragged from power and blinded in the streets. The very reforms and institutions that Michael IV had created would prove his greatest legacy. They armed the people with the means to defend the type of empire he had envisioned. In the end, the barefoot emperor's final victory came not through his succession plan, but through its failure. The people's uprising against his nephew proved that Byzantium had changed forever. No longer would birth alone determine destiny. The peasant emperor had taught them that power could come from below, that merit could outweigh blood, that even the humblest coin counter could rise to reshape the world. In death, as in life, Michael IV had somehow managed to transform even defeat into triumph. The legacy of Michael IV, a peasant's rise to power. History's great ironies often reveal themselves only in retrospect. Michael I's brief, brilliant reign might have faded into obscurity, remembered only as a scandalous footnote about a peasant who seduced his way to power. Instead, his 11 years on the throne fundamentally altered the DNA of medieval governance. The Byzantine Empire after Michael was simply not the same creature it had been before him. In the centuries that followed, whenever reformers sought to challenge the aristocracy's grip on power, they invoked the barefoot emperor's precedent. His administrative innovations, standardized weights and measures, merit-based civil service, integrated military supply chains, became the gold standard for medieval statecraft from Venice to Baghdad. Even his enemies found themselves adopting his methods, grudgingly admitting that a money changer's practical wisdom had outstripped centuries of aristocratic theory. But perhaps Michael's most enduring legacy was not in systems or structures, but in the dangerous idea he planted in the medieval mind. That ability could trump birth, that power could rise from below. This notion, radical for its time, echoed down through the centuries. When the Italian city-states began elevating merchants to power, they studied Michael's playbook. When the Ottoman Empire created its meritocratic Janissary Corps, they borrowed from his reforms. Even the Renaissance humanists, celebrating the potential of the individual, nodded approvingly at the peasant emperor who had proved them right 5 centuries early. Today, visitors to Istanbul can still see traces of Michael's reign in the surviving walls of his hospitals, in the soaring domes of his monasteries, in the ancient foundations of his granaries. But his true monument isn't built of stone. It lives in every instance where merit challenges privilege, where practical wisdom confronts inherited power, where someone of humble birth dares to reshape the world. The barefoot emperor's final lesson still resonates. Greatness can emerge from anywhere, if only we have the wisdom to recognize it. In an age of carefully curated origin stories and polished legends, Michael VII's tale stands apart in its raw authenticity. He never forgot his peasant roots, never fully adopted the trappings of imperial power. Perhaps that was his greatest strength. He remained to the end a practical man solving practical problems, just on an empire-wide scale. In doing so, he demonstrated that sometimes the best qualification for power is simply the wit to use it well. The money changer's son, who counted his way to an empire, left us with a mathematical proof of power's true nature, that leadership is not inherited like genes, but earned through ability, that innovation often comes from society's edges rather than its center, and that the most effective ruler might just be the one who remembers what it's like to walk barefoot.